Hello, everyone. Greetings from Clough Hall on a rather desolate and deserted Rhodes campus these days. I'm John Kaltner from the Department of Religious Studies here at Rhodes, and I hope all of you are doing well and your families are coping with the public health crisis as best you can. Today, I'll be presenting this lecture for you that will provide a general overview and introduction to the Qur'an, the sacred text of Islam. You should already have a copy of the PowerPoint so that you can follow along, either if you printed that out or perhaps have it open on another device or a screen so that you can again continue along with my lecture today. The title of this lecture is Querying the Qur'an. And what I'll be doing is presenting a series of 9 questions about the Qur'an that I think it's important for people, especially non-Muslims, to be aware of as they study and think about the text of Islam. If you're a typical Rhodes student, chances are you haven't had a lot of familiarity or have read the Qur'an very much, and so a lot of this will probably be new information for you. So what we'll do is I'll identify each of the questions as we go along, say a little bit about each one, and again, feel free to follow along on your PowerPoint as you like. So we'll begin with probably a very burning question for many of you, and that is, how do you spell Qur'an? Do you spell it with a Q or do you spell it with a K? You've probably seen both spellings on various occasions, and actually the reason why that's the case is that both are appropriate and perfectly legitimate in English. But in fact, only one of them is correct or more correct in the language of the original language of the Quran, which is Arabic. These are 2 different letters in the Arabic language, just as in English, and the sound of them is quite different. So that the K sound in Arabic is very much like the ka, the hard ka in English. So it's like the C in crow. So ka, like that. The Q sound is more like the sound that the crow makes. So it's kind of in the back of the throat. So it's like ka, instead of ka in the back, okay? The Q sound is actually the letter in Arabic. So that's the more correct spelling according to Arabic. And so that's the one that I prefer to use. But again, you see the K very, very commonly in English as well. I might point out too that sometimes there are different first vowels in the word, right? You see sometimes K-O or Q-U. Actually, the U is the more proper because you don't have an O vowel in Arabic. Nonetheless, they're both appropriate. The bottom line is it's ultimately your call in terms of how you want to spell the word Qur'an. I again tend to prefer the Q-U spelling, but the KO is perfectly appropriate in English. Maybe a little bonus question here, and that is, what's with the apostrophe? You'll often see the word Qur'an written with a Q-U-R and then apostrophe A-N. That apostrophe is actually another letter in Arabic, and linguistically speaking, it's referred to as a glottal stop, which means you have to, of course, expel air to speak. And with a glottal stop, you actually stop the air for just a moment. So in Arabic, there is this letter that stops the air. So the correct pronunciation in Arabic would be Qur'an. So Qur'an. So there's a little bit of a stop between the R and the A. That's that word that's called in Arabic the Hamza. So regarding this first question, then, is it Qur'an with a Q or Qur'an with a K-O? Either one is fine in English, but just be aware that in fact in Arabic it's the Q-U that is the preferred spelling. On to our second question: why are we reading the Qur'an in search class? The title of this course, as I'm sure you well know, is The Search for Values in Light of Western History and Religion. Some people would argue that the Qur'an really isn't a Western text, and therefore we don't need to be reading it or considering it in a course like this one. And in fact, there's been some debate over the years among scholars and others regarding whether or not Islam is a Western is a Western religion. I personally believe that it is, although there are some reasonable, arguments to make on the other side. Regardless of where you come down on that argument or in that debate, there's really no doubt that the Quran has been tremendously influential in the Western world and in shaping society. And so, even though it's been often misunderstood, the Quran has played, and Islam plays a vital role in our world today. That misunderstanding, by the way, came home to me in a really powerful way a few years back when I read the results of a survey that was given by the Pew Foundation. And they asked Americans a host of all kinds of questions about different religious traditions and their attitudes toward them. And a couple of things that came out in that survey really jumped off the page for me and, quite honestly, alarmed me a little bit. One of them was that only about 50% of Americans know that the Quran is the equivalent of the Bible in Islam. Only half of us know that. And maybe even more shockingly, about 60% of us, according to this survey, did not know that fact about the Quran, or the fact that God in Arabic or God in Islam is referred to as Allah. Now that's incredible that almost 2/3 of us don't know those two basic facts about Islam. And the reason why I find it so troubling is that, well, let me put it this way. Do you know anybody who doesn't have an opinion about the Quran or about Islam? Of course not. And yet, if 50% or more of us don't know those basic facts about Islam, what are they basing those opinions on, right? And so it's vitally important for us that we be aware of this, again, very often misunderstood religious tradition that's so vital to the world. So the Quran clearly, because this is a course on meanings and value, clearly the Quran is relevant for a course like Search, even if perhaps it might seem a little strange to some of us that it doesn't quite fit in a course on Western history and religion. Okay, let's move on to our third question, which begins to then get at the heart of some of the issues surrounding the Quran as a sacred text. And so that next question would be, who wrote the Quran? Well, the answer to that question depends on whom you ask. In fact, the word write, according to, if you ask a Muslim that question, they'll likely answer in one way. If you ask a non-Muslim, they'd probably answer in a different way. For Muslims, the verb to write would be the wrong verb to use in reference to the Quran. And that can be seen in the basic meaning of the word Qur'an itself. Qur'an in Arabic comes from a verb, qara'a, that means to recite, perhaps to read. And so the word Qur'an is a recitation, right? It's something that's meant to be spoken and proclaimed and not simply read as in a book. So for pious Muslims, no one wrote the Quran because, in the sense of composing it, because it was a text that was dictated, right, rather than written down initially. And so the idea in Islam is that the Quran is a message from God that was sent to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. And so there's this clear sense of transmission of the spoken text before it was eventually written down at a later point. Now, this is somewhat different from the Bible, because the word Bible actually comes from a Greek word, ta biblia, and Bible, ta biblia, means a written text. So whereas the Bible is a set of written documents initially, and that can be seen in its very name of the text, the Bible, ta biblia, the Quran, as the recitation, is a spoken text, and it's meant to be proclaimed. And that's why, again, for Muslims, to say who wrote the Quran really doesn't quite address the nature of the text as properly as one might think. Now, as mentioned just a moment ago, the Quran itself is intimately tied to the circumstances and the life of the Prophet Muhammad. He was born in about the year 570, so some more than half millennium after the time of Jesus. And he was born in an area in modern-day Saudi Arabia that is the focal point of Islam to this day. He was born in a city called Mecca, which is on the western coast, the western portion of the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad would have grown up as a typical member of Meccan society, so that this was a polytheistic system, religious system, and he would have probably, in all likelihood, been a polytheist himself early in his life. We don't know a great deal about his life, by the way. There are some biographies of the Prophet that exist, but they are dated. They come from much later, a century or two after his own death, and so they're not particularly, scholars and historians question their reliability, but they do give us some information about his life. The key event in his life, in terms of the development and the rise of Islam, took place when he was around 70 years old. So sometime around the year 610, Muhammad had what he and his followers came to see was the first of a series of revelations from God through the angel Gabriel to him that lasted over the rest of his life. So he dies in about 632. So these begin in 610. So what the Qur'an is a record of this 22-year set of revelations and messages that come to Muhammad over the course of his lifetime. Now, a second key moment occurs about halfway through that 22-year period. The message of Islam, by the way, the word Islam means submission, right? A Muslim is someone who submits, who does Islam. And Islam teaches that one should submit to the will of God, the one God. Now, the interesting thing was that Mecca was a polytheistic there was a polytheistic culture at the time, and Mecca was a major center, actually a popular pilgrimage spot for the polytheistic religion of the Arabian Peninsula at this time. So not surprisingly, this message of monotheism did not play very well in Mecca. And in particular, the leaders of the community, especially those who were dependent upon the resources, monetary and other resources, that being a pilgrimage site would have provided to the people of Mecca, they resented and did not really care for this message of monotheism that Muhammad was preaching. In fact, things got so bad that he and his followers, and they were a very small group, were being somewhat oppressed and mistreated by the people of Mecca. And so in about the year 622, an interesting event occurred. The people of Muhammad and his small group of followers were able to move from Mecca to a city further to the north that eventually became known as Medina, which simply means city in Arabic, Medinat an-Nabi, the city of the prophet. And the reason they were able to make this move was because the people of Medina had invited Muhammad to come and live among them and to serve as a type of judge for their community. They had heard word about him being a very effective leader, and so they invited him up to join them. So this small group of early Muslims make this trip from Mecca to Medina in 622, and that was such an important event that it became year one in the Muslim calendar. So as you might know, Islam has a different calendar than the one that we use in our culture, and it begins with that migration, or in Arabic, the hijrah from Mecca to Medina. Okay, so it's a very, very important year. I mention this because it also has some bearing on how the Quran is read and the trip from Mecca to Medina, and I'll be coming back to that in just a few moments. Now, what I just laid out, so anyway, Muhammad makes the trip to Medina, and this is in 622. He dies in 632, so he spends the last decade of his life living in Medina, but he makes periodic trips back to Mecca. And in fact, toward the end of his life, on his last trip, he's able to convert the people of Mecca to Islam, and this is considered to be one of the great events in the early history of Islam. Now, what I've just described for you is the traditional account or narrative of the birth of Islam, right, and the events that took place during Muhammad's lifetime. This account is often challenged by scholars, partly because of the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the earliest biography of Muhammad that we have comes from a much later period than when he lived himself, and so many think there were additions and perhaps developments over that time period. And so what this has led to is at times among scholars especially some debate over the precise origins of the Quran and of Islam itself. Some people, actually some scholars, want to date the Quran to quite a bit later than the time of the Prophet Muhammad, but the majority opinion is that the Quran, in essence, or basically the bulk of it, comes from this 22-year period when Muhammad was alive. In fact, but keep in mind, of course, it was always a spoken text, right? Qur'an, the recitation. The early sources make it clear that portions of the Quran were written down during the time of while Muhammad was still alive, but we have no idea who wrote that material and exactly what form it took. It was only after Muhammad's death that the entire Quran was assembled together, and all those various revelations were brought together into one collection in the text that we have today. But again, we don't really know who's responsible for writing it. Non-Muslims will often claim that Muhammad wrote the text, but in light of the way Muslims understand the way the text was revealed to Muhammad through Gabriel by God, that is not a position that Muslims themselves typically hold. So again, in broad terms, and to answer that question, who wrote the Quran, it really depends on who you ask. All Muslims would maintain that Muhammad did not write the text in the sense that he actually physically wrote down the words, but that he is the vehicle through whom the text was transmitted to humanity. Our fourth question is, why is there a Quran? Very important question. Well, this is tied to the Islamic understanding or view of revelation. According to that view, God's will was revealed through prophets like Muhammad throughout history. And in fact, if we look at the Quran, some more than 24 people are named in the text as prophets, prior prophets before Muhammad. And in fact, some of those names will look very familiar to people who are Bible readers. Folks like Noah, Abraham, Ishmael, Moses, David, Jonah, Job, Jesus are all considered to be prophets by Islam. We also have some non-biblical figures who are mentioned as prophets as well. For example, there are a couple of guys named Saleh and Shu'aib who are referred to as prophets in the Quran, and these, of course, are not folks mentioned in the Bible. In all likelihood, they are. There's also another one named Hud. Those three are, in all likelihood, the names of Arabian prophets who lived in the area prior to the time of Muhammad, who are not associated with the Bible in any way. All of the people mentioned as prophets are male, but there's an interesting issue concerning Mary, the mother of Jesus. A couple of things are interesting about her. First of all, she's the only woman who's mentioned by name in the Quran explicitly. Other women are referred to, but usually with titles or in relationship to men they're associated with. Mary is the only one who has her own name. And another fascinating thing is that the way Mary's story is told in the Quran, it coheres very closely with the way other prophets are presented. And so this has raised some interesting questions about whether or not Mary should be considered to be a prophet. Islam has never accepted this idea for a variety of reasons, but there are some scholars who have floated this idea. In fact, I'm in the middle of right now reading a manuscript written by a Muslim friend of mine who teaches up in Pennsylvania, who is making precisely this argument that perhaps Muslims should rethink Mary's position and maybe include her among various prophets. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but for example, there's a chapter in the Qur'an that's called the prophets, and some 20 to 24 people are mentioned by name specifically in that chapter, and every one of them is considered to be a prophet in Islam, except Mary, but she's mentioned by name in that chapter. So that's a very, very intriguing set of, group of company that she's keeping there with all of these prophets. Now, some of the prophets were given books according to the teachings of Islam, and the predominant ones are Moses, who was given the Torah, David, who was given the book of Psalms, and Jesus, who was given the gospel. Okay, so there's a distinction here with some of the prophets regarding their the role that they've played in terms of communicating divine revelation to humanity. Sometimes it's in book form. Now, within Islam and we're getting to this question of why is there a Qur'an? In Islam, there is this view, though, that the books that were given to prior prophets, like Moses, David, and Jesus, was legitimate revelation from God. But what happened was that the writings were tampered with. It wasn't the prophets themselves who did the tampering, but the followers of those prophets. So what this led to then was the idea that the revelation God had given to earlier peoples was somehow tainted. Okay, and what that necessitated then was a final revelation and a final prophet. And according to Islam, the Quran is that final revelation, and Muhammad is the final prophet for humanity. And so he's the last in a series of whole chain of prophets who were all, according to the teaching of Islam, given the same message, but those the prior writings did not accurately preserve that message. So this is why Muhammad, a title that's given to him in the Quran, is in Arabic Khatam al-Anbiya, or the seal of the prophets. He was the final one of the prophets. There will be no prophets after Muhammad. And so why is there a Quran? Well, there's a Quran because God has continually spoken to humanity throughout history, the various prophets, but the message of God was not perfectly received. It was the message of Islam or submission, but the prior revelations did not accurately communicate that message. And so a final prophet was needed in the form of Muhammad, and he perfectly preserves the message from God to humanity, and that is the text of the Quran. All right, so our fifth question is, how is the Quran arranged? When we open up the text, what is the Quran like? Well, it's a complicated question in that the Quran doesn't tell a story the way much of the Bible does. In fact, a Bible reader opening up the Quran, expecting it to read like the Quran, is going to be immediately confused and a little bit disoriented by what he or she confronts, because the Quran tends to skip around quite a bit, right? Where does the Bible begin? Well, if we include the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, it begins in the beginning, literally. It follows, kind of more or less a narrative story, right? A particular group of people, the Israelites, later become the Jewish people. If we continue on with the New Testament, it picks up the story of Jesus, then in Acts, the story of the church, etc., and it ends with the book of Revelation, which is the end times. So there's more or less a coherent, cohesive narrative throughout the course of the Bible. That isn't the way the Quran is arranged at all. And so, again, it tends to move from subject to subject, from character to character. So it doesn't quite tell a story. It doesn't tell a story in the way that the biblical text presents itself. And so this can create the appearance of a sort of haphazard or random arrangement especially for the Bible reader, right, who's used to a religious text conforming to the standard of the Bible. How's the Quran arranged? Well, it's arranged in chapters, just like the Bible. It has 114 chapters of about 4,300 verses, which is about the same length as the New Testament. So the New Testament and the Quran are approximately the same length. And each of those chapters is identified with both a number and a name. So most non-Muslims simply identify the Quran by the number of the chapter. But Muslims, many of them at least, will prefer to identify them by their names. These names come from some theme or kind of special word, or perhaps a personal name that's found within that chapter. So, for example, we have chapter 4 is called Women, and that's because there are many passages that refer to and relate to issues concerning women. Chapter 19 is called Mary. Again, she's the only woman mentioned by name in the text, and her name is given to one of the chapters where she figures quite prominently. Chapter 29 is called the Spider, because there's a reference to sort of a very minor, obscure reference to a spider, and that becomes the name of the chapter. Chapter 65 is divorce, because this is a theme that's found in that chapter. So again, it's common for non-Muslims to refer to the chapters by number, whereas many Muslims will designate the chapter by its name. In fact, if you open up even a translation into English of any Quran, it'll typically, in the beginning, the table of contents, it will identify the names of the chapters, and also at the beginning of each chapter, you'll typically see that as well. How's the Quran arranged? Well, it's arranged in not chronological order, in terms of the first chapter being the first one revealed until right on through to the last, but rather by length. So after a very brief introductory chapter, we get the longest chapter in the Quran, and then they get progressively shorter until toward the end we have the briefest chapters in the Quran. So for example, after that opening chapter, chapter 2 is the longest one. It has 286 verses. And then again, it's not perfect. They're not counting words exactly, but they get progressively shorter until the shortest of the 114 chapters is chapter 108. And it has only 3 verses in the entire chapter. Now here, oh, by the way, and here's a good way of kind of highlighting the fact that the Quran is not chronologically presented. What's traditionally considered to be the first chapter revealed to Muhammad of the Quran is found all the way toward the end in chapter 96. And it begins in Arabic, Iqra, Iqra, bism rabbika alladhi khalaq. Iqra means recite, Quran, Iqra. So that's considered to be the first chapter, but it's all the way toward the end in first chapter chronologically, but it's toward the end of the book. Now, here's where, to return to a point we discussed earlier, here's where the trip from Mecca to Medina becomes interesting and quite important. Remember, Muhammad makes that trip with a small group of followers in the year 622, about 10 years before he dies. And there's a distinction in the Quran between those chapters that were revealed to Muhammad prior to going to Medina and those that were revealed later. They're referred to as the Meccan chapters and the Medinan chapters. Okay, and there are many more Meccan chapters than there are Medinan chapters. But in fact, there's more content from Medina than from Mecca, and that's because the Medina chapters tend to be longer. Okay, so this creates an interesting situation. If the Medinan chapters, which chronologically are later, are found toward the beginning of the book, and the Meccan chapters, which are chronologically earlier, are found toward the end of the book, that means if you want to get a sense of the chronological development of the Quran, in the general sense, it's better to read the text backwards. So start with chapter 114 and make your way 113, 112, etc., toward the front. And then you'll get a closer feel for the types of sort of the chronological development of the text. It won't be perfect, but at least give you some indication. And you'd notice some very interesting characteristics and features of those two areas. Just to give you a little feel for this, there's a recent translation of the Quran into English that has 375 pages. The first half of the Quran, chapters 1 through 57, take up, it's more than 375 pages. The first half of the Quran takes up 375 pages, chapters 1 through 57. And then chapters 58 through 114, the second half, takes only 85 pages. So that gives you a sense, again, of the, just how long those earlier, those first chapters are. Now, despite the fact that the Quran can seem a little bit random and haphazard especially to the Bible reader, it's important to note that scholars have determined, in fact, that there is a certain logic and structure to the Quran, and many of them have analyzed the text, and particularly from the point of view of the rhetoric, right, the way the message is presented, but also certain literary features like repetition and patterns within the text. It's quite clear that there is a logical structure to especially the individual chapters of the Quran, but it's very different from what the Bible is. And so here too is another way in which we can see how we can't simply impose the the experience of the Bible reader onto the Quran and assume that they're going to be the same thing. All right, on to question 6. And that is, why are some copies of the Quran referred to as interpretations? Sometimes you'll actually see this on the cover of a Quran. It will say the Quran an interpretation or interpreted by, and then it will have the translator's name on it. The reason for this is that Islam has a different view and understanding of Scripture than Judaism and Christianity does. Muslims believe, and the Quran teaches, that the Quran is the verbatim word of God. So it is literally God's word. And it's only in its original language of Arabic that the Quran is perfectly preserved and accurately preserved. The Quran is the oldest literary work and text that we have in Arabic, and Islam teaches that it's only that form, the Arabic form, that is the true form of the Quran. And this is key and crucial because of the way the Quran is written. It's actually all written in poetry, or it might be better to refer to it as a rhyming prose. Each verse in each chapter of the Quran, even the chapter, like chapter 2, that has 286 verses, each verse will end in either the same sound or a very similar sound throughout the entire chapter. So here's an example of that. Here's that first introductory chapter of the Quran. Here it is in Arabic, and even though if you don't know Arabic, you should be able to hear a certain type of rhyming that's taking place here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawm ad-Din, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een, Ihdina sirat al-Mustaqim, Sirat alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayri maghdubi alayhim wala dhalin. Saddaqa al-Azim. You hear all those eens over and over again? That's the end of each verse in that short chapter. The entire Quran is written with that sort of rhyming pattern throughout. Again, even if a chapter is hundreds of verses long, each verse will always end in a very similar sound. That can't be reproduced in another language. Well, you can try, but it's going to be really ugly. It's not going to work well at all. In fact, I'm not aware of any attempts to ever try to translate the Quran into another language other than Arabic that tries to preserve that rhyming, because again, it would just be very ugly and it wouldn't do the text justice. And so for this reason, because no other language is able to capture that essence, that sound of the Quran, Muslims maintain it's not actually the Quran, because the sound of the text is part of the revelation from God to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. And so because that can't be duplicated, it's simply interpreting the Quran rather than actually presenting the Quran as such. And so any translation is simply offering one interpretation without being able to express the text of the Quran. By the way, the same thing is true with the Bible and the act of any translation, right? Those of you who are, well, you've all studied another language, I'm sure, but those of you especially who are bilingual or trilingual or know multiple languages quite well, you know that you never are able to perfectly convey in the target language, the language you're translating into, what the original language says, right? Because a word is always going to have multiple meanings in its original language that won't be the case in the target language. So in a sense, any act of translation is an act of interpretation. Okay, question 7. And this is one that's very, very important and quite interesting, and that is, how is the Quran related to the Bible? Well, like many relationships, it's a complicated one that I guess we can say has had its ups and downs at times. The good news is that the Quran itself claims that it comes from the same God who revealed the Bible, so that there is a definite connection between the Bible and the Quran. By the way, not every non-Muslim holds that view. In fact, many Jews or Christians would argue that no, the Bible, God of the Bible is different from the Bible of the Quran. It's important to note that that's not what Islam teaches, and that's not what Muslims maintain. Clearly, in the Quran, there's no doubt that the God of the Quran is the God of the Bible. So, because of that, the fact that the Quran teaches that the God who reveals it is the God of the Bible, this has led to the presence of a particular way of referring to Jews and Christians in particular in the Quran as the people of the book, because they too, Jews and Christians, have been given a book. Quran never identifies exactly who the people of the book are, but it's very clear that Jews and Christians are to be included, and some would argue that perhaps even Zoroastrians, which is a religion that began thousands of years ago in the area of modern-day Iran, has a book, and perhaps that Zoroastrians should also be included. In the modern day, there are a few Muslims who have even suggested that maybe Buddhists and Hindus, any people who have a book, should be considered among the people of the book, although not all would hold that view. So that's the good news, right? That the Bible and the Quran come from the same source. The bad news is that whole corruption thing that we talked about earlier, right? The idea that somehow the earlier revelations were tampered with, and this required the sending of the Quran. Despite that claim that the earlier texts were tampered, the Quran and the Bible have a great deal in common. Many characters are found in both, similar stories, very common themes are found throughout both the Bible and the Quran. So there's clearly a very, very close connection between the two texts. What's fascinating, though, and very important to note, and you'll see this when you're doing some of the readings for search, is that whenever the Quran tells a story that has a biblical parallel, in other words, a story in the Bible that's also found in the Quran, there's always a process of Islamization of those biblical traditions. In other words, the stories are never told in exactly the same way, but they're always presented in a way that conforms to and coheres with the Islamic environment and context of the Quran. Let me give you just a couple of brief examples of this. Here's a trivia question I'll ask you and see if you know the answer to. How many times does Noah speak in the Bible? It's actually one time, and it comes at the very end of his story. The story of Noah and the flood is told in Genesis 6 through 9, so 4 chapters in the Bible. And all through that entire story, when Noah starts to build the ark, when the rain starts, when he's riding out the storm, when he gets back onto dry land, Noah never says a word, not a peep out of him. It's only when he finally gets off the ark and he's back on land that Noah actually speaks. And his only words in the entire Bible are words of curse, in which he curses the offspring of one of his sons. It's in Genesis 9. Those are the only words Noah ever says in his entire biblical, his story in the Bible. You open up the Quran, and Noah is constantly speaking. You can't get the guy to shut up. He's always talking. And why is that? Because he's a prophet, and prophets are supposed to speak. Now, Noah is not a prophet in the Bible, but he is in Islam. And so because of that different role that he plays, a prophet's role is to encourage, remind, sort of exhort their followers and people to do the right thing, right? And so Noah does that a great deal in the Quran, whereas in the Bible, he's basically silent, right? Here's another quick example. Both the Quran and the Bible present the story of Moses' birth, one of the most famous birth stories in the Bible, right? Where the tradition about little baby Moses being put into the basket by his mother to protect him from Pharaoh, and he ends up floating down the river and eventually ending up in Pharaoh's household where he grows up. The Quran has that very same story. In fact, it has 2 versions of that story. But what's fascinating is that there's someone who's missing in action in the biblical story whose fingerprints are all over the Quranic story, and that's God. In the Quran, God's behind everything that happens in the story of Moses' birth. But in the Bible, God is not mentioned a single time in the entire biblical text. Why is that? Well, Islam teaches that nothing happens without God, right? That God is behind everything that takes place in the world. And so that's reflected, that belief is reflected in how the story of Moses' birth is told. Whereas in the biblical tradition, you read that story, and again, God has no role at all. And that's, again, it's a reworking, an interpretation of the biblical story within the Quran in order to reflect Muslim beliefs and views about the role that God plays in the world. And so the 2 texts have much in common. When we answer this question of how is the Quran related to the Bible, the 2 texts have much in common, and you'll see this when you're reading for your search classes. But there are very, very important differences, and those differences are typically due to, again, this role of Islamization, interpretation of the biblical traditions in order to present them in a more Islamic form and fashion. Okay, we're on the home stretch. Hope you're hanging in there. 2 more questions to go. Question number 8. How do Muslims study and use the Quran? Well, they take kind of the quick and simple answer to this is that there is a different way. Typically, there has been historically a different way of studying the Quran, even academically, than what is commonly done on the side of the Bible. You have now taken more than a semester of search class, and you've read a lot of biblical texts, and you've probably been exposed to some of the ways that Bible scholars go about the work of reading the Bible and trying to interpret it and to understand it. Very often in biblical studies, the interest is in, or one of the interests is in, how did we get the text that we have, right? This is often referred to as historical critical study of the text of the Bible. We're trying to understand, were there sources behind the text? Were there different authors? Were there different editors? How did this text take shape? What sort of a community was it supposed to be responding to? What issues was it trying to address, right? This is referred to as, again, the historical critical method of studying the Bible, where, again, the focus is very much on asking questions about how the text came to be, right? Now, in light of what I've been saying up to this point, it should be clear that that question is less central or important for the Muslim or for Islam, because Islam teaches that it knows where the text came from, right? It came from God through Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. There's a very literal view of revelation in Islam that is not unlike what we see among, say, more conservative Christians and Jews, right, who tend to take a more literal view of the Bible as the Word of God. And so Muslim scholars traditionally operate under these parameters, within these parameters, and they haven't typically asked those sorts of questions about where did the text come from. By the way, that's beginning to change a little bit, I'd say, in the past 20 plus years, where many scholars, including a fair number of Muslim scholars, are beginning to ask those questions of the origin of the text. As you might imagine, sometimes this is a somewhat controversial issue within Islam, but there are a number of scholars, Muslim scholars, who are doing some very interesting work in this area. So in Islam, the focus really in studying the text hasn't been on how did we get this text, but rather on the text itself, right? What is this text? So the text as we have it. And so the interest in, when it comes to study of Islam, has been on things like lexicography, the meanings of words, right? Again, Arabic was the first, the Quran was the first literary text in Arabic. And so the meanings of the words became very, very important. In fact, other than the Chinese, the Arabs were the first people to compose and write dictionaries. One of the reasons for that was because of the text of the Quran. They wanted to understand, what does this religious text that's so important for us, what do these words actually mean? Similarly, grammar. The Arabs made some very, very important contributions to grammar, the study of grammar, and that was because of the role of the Quran within Islam. And of course, the meaning of the text and the application of the text, right? How should this text function in people's lives were very, very important questions. So once again, the focus has been not so much on where did this text come from, but the text as we have it, right? The text as we experience it. How do Muslims use the Quran? Well, they use the Quran very much in very similar ways that Jews and Christians use the Bible. It's recited aloud in community contexts, private devotions, prayers at funerals, sometimes at weddings you'll hear the Quran. Typically the Quran is found in every home, but in my experience, I think the Quran, I lived in the Middle East for many years, the Quran often plays a much more visible and prominent role in Muslim society and daily life than the Bible typically does. For example, I lived in Cairo for many years and in Egypt, and it was very rare that I would go into a taxi cab and there wouldn't be a copy of the Quran right on the dashboard when you walked in. Or you'd see the Quran in stores or sort of functioning in decorative ways within society. You really don't see that, again, in our culture very often. So it's a text that's very commonly heard a great deal, right? There are radio stations, television stations, websites that play the Quran repeatedly, sometimes 24/7, right, all day long. You also hear it a lot in, for example, public recitation. Some people memorize the entire text of the Quran, and there will be competitions among people for who can recite it the best. And if you have a chance, you might do a web search for Quran recitation in Arabic. And even if you can't hear, if you don't understand Arabic, you'll be just amazed at the different ways that the Quran can be recited and proclaimed. And so when it's recited by someone who has that training, it's it's an incredibly beautiful art form that, again, even for the person unfamiliar with the language that's being proclaimed, will really be struck by it. So the Quran is seen a great deal. It's heard a great deal within societies, within Muslim majority countries. Another important point to note is that Islam is what's referred to as an aniconic religion. That means that it does not permit images, especially images of human beings, and sometimes go so far as animals. And that's because the view is that only God can create life. And so human beings should not attempt to take God's place by representing another human being or another life form. Well, what that means is that when you go into a mosque, you don't see, as you do in many churches, for example, and even some synagogues, you'll see paintings and representations of people or scenes from the Bible, etc. You go into a mosque, you never see any of that. You will never see a depiction of a human being in a mosque. But what you will see is a great deal of calligraphy, very highly stylized, ornamental, beautiful calligraphy. Much of it is from the Quran itself. So this is both inside buildings and sometimes outside mosques and other buildings where the Quran is seen as it's used for decorative purposes. So this is another way in which the Quran is a regular part of daily life for Muslims. Okay, our last question is sort of broadening our scope just a little bit. Is what other sources are important for understanding the Quran? Well, we have many commentaries. Commentaries are works that attempt to explain, analyze, and discuss a particular text. You comment on the text. And so we have the commentary tradition in Islam. It goes back to the earliest decades of Islam, and we have many commentaries over the years. Very often they are multiple volumes that discuss the text of the Quran in very careful detail. Some of them are comprehensive, treat the whole Quran. Others will look at just portions of the Quran or particular themes in the Quran. These commentaries are cited and referred to very frequently by Muslims in order to try to understand, get a better sense of the text itself. And then we have a whole variety of other sources that we can say are related to Muhammad somehow, that have a connection with the Quran. Preeminent among these is a body of material that's referred to as the Hadith, Hadith. The Hadith are lengthy collections, again, of the sayings of Muhammad and reports of what Muhammad did during his lifetime. It's an interesting fact that the Quran is not about Muhammad at all. This is a mistake that many non-Muslims make. Actually, the word Muhammad, the name Muhammad, appears only 4 times in those 6,300 verses of the Quran. The text isn't really about Muhammad at all. Muhammad's simply the vehicle through whom it's reported. He's referred to in other ways as the prophet or the messenger, etc., but the emphasis is not on Muhammad. But from the early days of Islam, there was a great interest in trying to preserve and recall how Muhammad lived his life. He became a model, an example for Muslims. And so over time, this whole body of material called the Hadith was collected together. And by the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era, they had been brought together and put in these collections. There are 4 or 5 main collections of the Hadith, and they contain literally thousands of traditions about Muhammad that cover all the range of human experience, everything from how to pray to literally how to go to the bathroom. I mean, it's just everything that Muhammad did, everything that he said, everything that he observed is recorded in these traditions. Many of them are related to the Quran in the sense that they're sometimes used with the Quran in order to try to sort of understand, what the Quran is teaching about about a certain thing, but sometimes Muhammad refers to the Quran in the course in this hadith material, so it's quite significant in that way. Another source is the biography of Muhammad. I mentioned that there's the most famous and most important of his biographies. It was composed a century or more after his death. Nonetheless, the biography of the Prophet is a major source for Muslims because it fills in a lot of the gaps in terms of what was going on in his life when the Quran was being revealed. So it's a very, very important resource for Muslims. And the biography of the Prophet also makes specific reference to moments when the Quran was revealed. And this relates to the third and the final source outside the Quran that I want to call your attention to, and that is something that's referred to in Arabic as the asbab al-nuzul, or the occasions of revelation. Muslims have the text of the Quran, but understandably, they were always curious about, well, why did this text come? Why did a particular passage come about? And what is it in reference to, right? What's the context? What was the original context of the text? Well, over time, traditions developed that tried to answer this very question, so that there is this body of material called the Asbab al-Nuzul, or the occasions of revelation, that actually identify what was going on in the life of Muhammad or within the life of the community when a particular passage of the Quran was revealed to him. And so these are, again, very important for establishing the social and the political and the cultural context of the various ways that the Quran came about. So I mention these only because it's important to note that Muslims are not just relying on the Quran itself when they when they're trying to make sense of it or to understand it. They're also drawing upon material in these other sources, like the Hadith, like the biography of Muhammad, and like the occasions of revelation that play a very, very important role. I'll conclude by just saying that there are many introductions to the Quran. You're only going to spend a few class periods here in search looking at this material, and it's my hope that this will whet your appetite and make you keenly interested in wanting to learn more about the Quran, because it is, again, such a vitally important text in our world, and it's essential that you know as much as possible as you can, right? You don't want to be one of those 60% people, and I know you're not, because you're taking this course, and I applaud the search program for including the Quran in this course. But it's just absolutely essential that we know as much as we can about this very, very important book. And so there are quite a few introductions to the Quran that are available for non-Muslims, very, very accessible. And I'd encourage you to pick one up and read through it so that you can learn as much as you possibly can. We've just sort of presented things in very general terms here today in this lecture, and it's my hope that perhaps, again, it will spur you on to want to learn more about Islam. I do teach some courses here at Rhodes related to the Bible and the Quran. In fact, I'm doing a new course in the fall on Islamophobia, where the Quran will be really a focus on it, but it's, a course that hopefully will, again, allow students to think a little bit about their own attitudes and perceptions toward Islam. I went a little bit over our 50-minute period. Hope you'll forgive me for that. But I wish you well as you read through study the Quran and read through some of its passages. And more importantly, I wish you well as we all wrestle with this, and kind of live in this new reality that we're facing. I hope you and your families stay well and are healthy. And I look forward to seeing you on campus in the fall semester. If you have any questions, want to drop me a note or continue this conversation, please feel free to do so. Kaltner@rhodes.edu. So until we see each other again, best of luck to you, and I hope you have a great semester. rest of the semester. Take care.